Tim Sharp is an internationally renowned psychologist and founder of the Happiness Institute. He's penned several books on the topics of happiness and well-being, including Habits for Happiness and Transformation, Turning Tragedy into Triumph. He appears to be partial to alliteration. Tim is a heavyweight of the Australian positive psychology arena, so I thought, who better to explain to me what the hell all of that is? We chatted about measuring happiness, the role of expectation, heritability, extraversion, not the olive oil, the interplay between happiness and wealth, framing techniques, and the homeostasis of emotions. I had a great time talking with Tim, and I'm sure that everyone will find at least one or two things within the conversation that are in some way relatable. I give you Tim Sharp. Okay, if the world was ending tomorrow, what would be your last meal?
Oh, well, it's a tough one because I've got lots of favourite cuisines and I've had lots of amazing meals. So it'd probably be more about the people I'm with. So it'd probably be with my wife and children. And it would probably be in a nice, comfortable location with great food, but not necessarily too formal. So I guess one of my favourite restaurants in Sydney is Chiswick, which I think is has top really beautiful food, really fresh and healthy, but again, sort of semi-relaxed as well. So.
It's a great place. I love Chiswick. Haven't been for years. Miss it though. Two-pronged question. What is your favourite virtue, and which virtue do you think is most overrated?
Oh, the first one's easy, the second one's hard. The first one I think is pretty easy. I'd probably say kindness. I think it's certainly something I try to practice on a daily basis as often as I can. It's certainly something I think the world could do a lot more of. And it's kind of something you can't really have too much of it, which is a great thing. So yeah, so I'd go with kindness. Overrated, that's a tough one because I guess a virtue by definition is a good thing, I suppose. And if they're used in the right way, they shouldn't necessarily be overrated or bad. But I'll go out on a limb and say leadership. And that's because I think, although they can be very important, I think often there's too much focus on leadership and not fellowship, or teamship, or whatever you might want to call it. So yeah, that's a tricky one to answer, but I'll go with that.
That's good. I like it. And the third one is, who is the first person that you remember looking up to in your life?
Oh, that's a difficult one as well, because to be honest, I don't have a very strong memory from my childhood. I've got vague memories, and it gets stronger as I go along. I guess, to be honest, the first thing that came to mind was my father. That's a bit cliche, but then the second thing. So yeah, now I'll possibly go with that still. But the second thing that came to mind was probably a sports person. I still love sport, but I loved sport all through my childhood. And I think when I was growing up, I either wanted to be Don Bradman or Arthur Beetson, or I went for the Roosters, so a football team. I'm not sure if you follow the NRL,
yeah.
But it was probably either my father or one of the great sports people that I followed when I was younger, and still follow.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. Good one. So on to the topic of, I guess, happiness. My first question to you is, how do we measure happiness?
It's a really good question. It's actually, as a professional, as a psychologist, it's actually much harder to answer than most people realise. Because, there are multiple answers. So the simplest way to measure happiness is to ask someone. You can simply say, "Are you happy?" Or "How are you feeling today?" or something like that. And that's, although that's incredibly simplistic in a lot of ways, it's also a pretty good measure. Like we know the answers that people give are pretty valid. However, it's obviously it is an oversimplification, and it's not necessarily the way that most of us think about happiness. When we think about happiness, and certainly as a positive psychologist, when we talk about happiness, we tend to talk about it in a much broader sense. So what that means is that there are actually much more sophisticated versions of measurements of happiness. And in fact, what people probably don't realise, if they're not psychologists, is there are hundreds of measures. There are hundreds of questionnaires and surveys that either measure happiness in a broader, more complex, sophisticated way, and or measure the subcomponents of happiness, of which there are several, like meaning and purpose in life, or the quality of our relationships, or things like hope and optimism. So yeah, I suppose the answer to your question is there are multiple ways to measure it. It's not necessarily that any are better or worse than the others, it's just that they measure different things. So I guess if you are trying to measure it, you need to know what you're measuring and then what you'll get out of that.
And so do you think that sort of mechanism through which we measure happiness ourselves sort of changes over time as well? I mean, the way that we rate our happiness, and I guess even in the context of, are we talking about being happy in our lives or being happy with our lives? And almost the question changes your subjective response in the instance that you're asked day to day.
Very much so. So to go back to what I said earlier, if you ask that simple question, if I said, are you happy, or how happy are you, that's measuring a type of happiness that we would tend to refer to as a positive emotion. So happiness in that sense is one of many positive emotions, like joy and contentment and satisfaction and pride, and those sorts of emotions, positive emotions, which are good obviously, but they tend to be quite fleeting. So that can change, as you kind of hinted at in your question, that can change from minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day. And that's why, so a positive psychologist or an academic would probably be more likely to ask something like, taking everything into account, how happy are you with your life overall? And that's a much broader measure of what we might call quality of life or life satisfaction that tends to look beyond those fleeting emotions. So it doesn't, so, maybe something crappy happened to you 5 minutes ago, or you spilt something on your iPad, or but it goes beyond that, those minute to minute, day to day hassles, of which we all have many, and it's a bigger picture. So what I might say, even though I've had a crappy day, my life's pretty good. And so my answer then would hopefully reflect that. And there's all sorts of, again, a whole range of other questions in between and above and beyond that can assess it in a slightly different way.
What about, I've heard you talk before about the tyranny of when, which in as much as I understand it is a convincement of yourself that, I will be happy when I get X, Y, Z. How does that interact with a person's ability to set goals?
It's a really good question, and it's one of the so to go back to the tyranny of when is one of the biggest obstacles to happiness. It's one of the biggest roadblocks. So we've all done it at some point in our lives. Pretty much everyone has this. When we say, I'll be happy when I've lost weight, when I've put on weight, when I've made more money, when I've got a better job, when I've found a girlfriend, whatever. And what that does is constantly delay or defer happiness. It puts it in the future, which means we're never there. Or even when we do get there, we want something else. We want something better or bigger. So what it does is contribute quite significantly and unhelpfully to a constant state of dissatisfaction and disappointment. The flip side of that, as you quite rightly said, is that goal setting is important and very helpful. So one of the things we know that does contribute to happiness and satisfaction with life is setting and working towards meaningful goals. That's a good thing to do, and something we all do, most of us do, I think, in different ways. However, as you've sort of hinted at in that question, that can actually be problematic if we don't enjoy the process along the way. And this is what a lot of us do. We set the goal, we work towards the goal, fine, that's a good thing to do. But if you don't enjoy any of those steps that you're taking, then you're only going to experience happiness on occasions when you achieve those goals, and often quite fleetingly, because one of the other mistakes we often make is we work hard, we get to the goal, we achieve the goal, woohoo, what's the next one? Or, woohoo, is that all there is? So, and unfortunately in our society particularly, and I see this even more in successful people. They strive, they work really hard, they achieve something, and then they don't even pause for barely a minute before they set the next one and move on. And it's a pity, because the remedy, the antidote to that, is something we call savouring, which can be, well, there's sort of two parts. But one is, as I hinted at, it's about enjoying the journey as well as the destination. I think often there's sort of
maybe it is about the journey for them, and that's why they move the goalposts as soon as they achieve
well, it can be.
Or
I
are
think
they
often,
not? Do you mean these are people that don't feel happy because they get there and then they move the goalpost constantly?
Well, there are some people like that,
right.
So definitely. But I think that too often those things are sort of pitted against each other. They're seen as kind of mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Either it's about the journey or it's about the destination. Well, I think it's about both. It's definitely about both. But the key really, and this is again one of the positive psychology strategies which we know is effective, is this concept of savouring, which is it's a form of appreciation, I suppose, appreciating wherever I am, whatever's going on, even if I'm not quite there yet, well, I'm trying, I'm working hard, and this is a part of it anyway. So we know that people that are able to practice that, and that it's closely related to gratitude in a sense, tend to be happier more often for longer.
And would you say that trying to keep in mind that enjoying the process while you're working towards a goal is almost like a framing technique, in the way that you could kind of say, I might not like doing this grueling work, but because I know that it gets me towards this particular goal, I can in some way sort of channel the enjoyment of that into something that I would otherwise hate?
Very much so. Look, I should admit my bias, and that's the type of psychology that I was trained in. So my background's in clinical psychology, which is a more traditional form of psychology. It's what most people think of, I suppose, counselling and therapy. So that's where I started out. I moved into positive psychology coaching. But my background in clinical psychology was predominantly an approach that's called cognitive behaviour therapy, or cognitive therapy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, it's been the most dominant form of therapy for all of my lifetime, I suppose, the last 40, 50, whatever years. So, and in essence, it's built on the idea that everything is really about the way we think about things. And so which is another way of describing reframing or framing. So my approach is very much coloured by the way we think about things, the way we frame what we're doing, how we're going about it, etc. So I would say yes. And I think I was actually just writing about this morning, that this is again, this is one of the things that I think differentiates happy and successful people from less happy and less successful people, and that's the ability to think about hard things in a positive way, I suppose. And a simple example, you can apply this to almost everything, but a simple example is something like exercise. Now, it's not that everyone has to exercise, but it's a nice tangible example that we can all relate to. And the way that, so people that struggle with exercising regularly often focus on the short-term costs. It's painful, it's sweaty, it takes time, it can be uncomfortable, I'm going to hurt afterwards. And they don't think about what will come beyond that if they keep it up. That those people that exercise regularly tend not to think about that. They tend to think about the longer term health benefits. I'm going to have more energy, so I'm going to be able to do more, I'm going to live longer and live better.
But don't they also get the same kind of dopamine hits that you do if you smash a bag of cocaine? Isn't it isn't exercise endorphin,
definitely, I don't know if it's quite the same as cocaine.
You wouldn't know.
I'll claim the Fifth Amendment or Fourth Amendment, whatever it is, I don't know. But no, so you definitely do. So there is what's sometimes called an exercise high. But you tend not to get that when you're starting out, though. So if you've never really exercised, or you're not very fit, you're going to have more pain than benefit.
So making that jump is the first, or making that getting over that first hurdle of getting into it.
Well, it's about, so coming back to the idea of framing, it's about thinking beyond the short term to the long. I mean, it's like if you're going to apply it to anything else, you apply it to financial wealth. It's about, if I put aside. They talk about the miracle of compound interest. So, if you put aside $1 a day, you don't just have $365 at the end of the year. You've got whatever, I don't know, because it's going to. But what that requires is seeing that interest in 6 months, 12 months, 10 years. Not just saying I've got $1 I don't have to spend today. It's about saying I'm going to have $10 I'll have in 10 years' time. It's the same sort of thing, and again you can apply it to almost everything that we can or could do to improve our lives requires that longer term outlook, I think.
Yeah. And so off the back of that, what do you think the role is for expectation with happiness?
Another great question, actually, because this is where a lot of people go wrong, and they have unrealistic expectations. We know unrealistic expectations is a recipe for disaster. You set yourself up for failure, you set yourself up for disappointment, frustration, a whole bunch of negative emotions, which then leads to hopelessness and helplessness, and then you give up, sort of. So it's not a good thing. Unrealistic expectations there's never a good way to do that. The trick, though, is having realistic expectations. So you won't feel let down, but you also want realistic expectations that are going to encourage you to strive for something maybe a bit more or a bit better, and that's where it gets a fine balancing act, setting what psychologists sometimes call stretch goals. So if you're too comfortable, if you say, I don't want I don't want to fail, I'm not going to try anything, and just stay within your comfort zone, it might be okay, but you're not going to really have a great life or any excitement, or
because you're not taking risks.
Because you're not taking risks,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's good to take risks at
Yeah.
times. It's good to stretch yourself, to go a bit beyond, but not too far.
Yeah.
So you go into that crash, and that's hard to find. Sometimes it's trial and error.
Yeah.
To get that balance right.
There's something I read about people when they start making more money, they begin to, I guess, indulge in more expensive versions of what they were doing before. And then simple pleasures aren't as pleasurable to them anymore. So there can be this sort of backfire effect of becoming more successful or rich or whatever it is, and then just experiencing less joy because they're just not getting the feedback that they used to.
Well, definitely. That goes to a couple of points. One, the age-old question about whether money buys happiness. Now, it's actually far more complex than most people realise. So you can't really answer that with a yes or no, which most people want a yes or no. But there's definitely some no to that, and that's what you've touched on there. And this is what psychologists and economists have sometimes called the hedonic treadmill. I think that might be what you're referring to.
I think
which
so.
is where you're sort of constantly chasing something, and particularly in our society where there's so much emphasis on growth, on economic growth, well, more money, more stuff, which isn't entirely bad, and this is why it's more complex. But one of the problems that can arrive, as you quite said, is that this is why people that earn more money don't necessarily save more, because they often just end up spending more. So, for example, I would never spend as much on this on a shirt as I spent on this 20, 30 years ago. When I was a poor student. Let's just say when you're, if you're 20, you might spend $20 on a shirt because that's all you can afford. You're struggling. But as you start to earn more and more money, you might spend $50, and then maybe you spend $100. And
You should be allowed to spend your age on a shirt.
I only just thought I'd have that. But it's the same with cars. It's the same with a house. You buy, if you're lucky enough to be able to afford a house, or even renting. And so, now again, there's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with spending more money or buying nice clothes, but there is a risk, and that's what you've said, that if you change your definition of what will give you pleasure, you continue to raise the bar, it can be harder and harder to achieve that.
Yeah. The keeping up with the Joneses aspect of it, I think, can be a little bit pernicious because, as far as I've looked into, apparently there's that figure thrown around, like anything over $70,000 is basically incrementally worth less and less to a person in terms of their happiness, except for when you put them in environments in which there's a disparity of earning and wealth between colleagues. And so, like, you'll have two people in a work relation environment. One person is going up the ladder, and the other one is staying exactly where they are, which presumably has nothing really to do with the more money that the second person is earning, and more that one person is getting ahead over another or achieving. And we've put a monetary value on that and said promotion.
So there's multiple issues in there. So we know that the extent to which you feel happy with your level of wealth depends on who or what you compare it to. So in very, very simple terms, this is a bit of an oversimplification, if you compare yourself to people that are wealthier than you, so if I look at those rich lists that come out every year or every 6 months, I will never feel wealthy because I'm not, so in the general scheme of things, I'm relatively wealthy. Certainly in terms of the world, if you look at the 7-8 billion people, I'm incredibly wealthy. But if I look at, the billionaires, I'm pretty poor. So if I look up, I'm going to feel less happy in a sense. If I look down, I'm going to feel more happy. And that can happen at a local level as well. So again, if you look at your next door neighbours, or so if you live in a suburb, for example, when you have one of the nicer houses, say, in one of the nicer streets, you'll feel good about that. But if you live in a better suburb where you're in one of the less better streets, you might feel bad about that. Or, as I said, in the workplace. In the workplace, there's another factor that's involved there, and that's that the salary we receive in work isn't directly associated with our workplace satisfaction, except what we know is important is that we need to feel we're receiving a fair and equitable wage. So if I look at, if I'm earning 100 grand and you're earning 150 grand, but I think you deserve that because you're doing a more difficult job or you're doing it better, then that's going to be fine. But if I feel we're actually doing the same job and we're doing it just as well, but hold on, you're earning 50 grand more, then I'm not going to be happy with that. So that's where, so from a psychological perspective, it's okay to pay people different levels, obviously, as long as it's fair and reasonable, which obviously is debatable.
What if you and I worked in an office together and I was getting paid 150 and you were getting paid 100, as you just said, but you felt more appreciated in the work that you did by our superiors?
Another great question. That applies to a whole lot of other things we've spoken about as well when it comes to money and happiness. I said earlier, it's there's not a yes or no answer. The simple answer is that money is relevant, salary is relevant, but it's certainly not the only factor. And what you've touched on is there are other factors, some of them probably more significant than money when it comes to happiness. So yes, we know that one of the most significant factors when it comes to happiness at work or job satisfaction, whatever you want to call it, one of the most significant factors is feeling appreciated. And in fact, we know that's probably one of the, if not the main reason, then it's in the top 2 or 3 main reasons why people leave jobs. People don't necessarily leave an employer, they often leave an underappreciated manager, a manager who doesn't appreciate them. And similarly, in a more general sense when it comes to money and happiness, again, money is relevant, you can't deny that, particularly at the lower levels. Very much at the lower level. If I'm and this is very relevant at the moment, if I'm struggling to pay the rent or pay my bills or put food on the table or buy the necessities, that's very stressful. And that sort of stress is not conducive to happiness, obviously. So at the very lower levels, it's very important. As you kind of hinted at a bit earlier, it becomes less and less important as you go up. So it's sort of like this, it's like an upward curve, and then it sort of flattens off. So it's still important, but it tapers. And this is where other factors become more important. So, once you get above, that whatever that reasonable level is, and there's a lot of debate about that, then you've got to look at other factors like the quality of our relationships, our physical health and well-being. Those are the sorts of things that are just as if not more, probably more important once you get above that sort of average wage or whatever you want to call it.
And so I guess the quality of our relationships is something that people often talk about being extremely important into the well-being of most individuals. Does that put extroverts at an advantage?
So going back to the first part of the question, I would say, based on the research, that it's the most important factor. I've spent almost all my life studying and researching and talking and practicing clinical psychology, positive psychology, and if I had to summarise the most important factor for good mental health, for happiness, for quality of life, for health and well-being, for longevity, I would almost certainly say it's about the quality of our relationships. And that includes not just, it includes our intimate relationships, husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, parents, etc., but also our community. So, like a sense of belonging, a sense of connectedness, that sort of thing as well. So there's absolutely no doubt that is vitally important. Does that put extroverts at an advantage? That's a much more complex question to answer. And so there's certainly some research that suggests that. My interpretation is it's a little bit misleading because I think what's most important is what I would call authenticity, I suppose. And as an introvert myself, I would say if I were to try to be an extrovert, which I've done in the past, it doesn't work. Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Well, so I'll give you an example. So when I first started doing a lot of public speaking and media work, which kind of came about by accident, I kind of thought I had to be, this Anthony Robbins type character. And I'm not, and it was a dismal fake. I mean, it was kind of fraudulent. It was fake. People could tell it wasn't real. And I could tell it wasn't. I didn't feel comfortable with it. So I learnt pretty quickly that wasn't going to work. And I learnt quite quickly that I could actually be a good speaker, a good communicator in my less energised, slightly quieter way. And it's the same with relationships.
Does that mean there's early footage of you jumping around a room?
Probably. Actually, you just reminded me. I probably should go and find it and delete it. It's funny. I mean, I do kind of turn into a bit more of an extrovert when I get on stage, which is probably another discussion. But what as an introvert myself, I've also learned, I mean, that doesn't mean I can't have good quality relationships. It just means I'll enjoy those relationships in a slightly different way. So,
yes, but what I meant to say is there even a slight differential in advantage to an extroverted person, do you think?
According to a number of studies, probably yes. But I really want to emphasise that it doesn't in any way mean that introverts can't be happy or just as happy.
Of course, yeah. I mean, because it's such a difficult and subjective thing to measure. Sorry, it's so hard to know. Would it be one of those things where, you know, somebody is 51% more likely to be happy if they're extroverted, and at that point, at the distribution end ranges, you've got all the introverts and all the extroverts.
Well, kind of, but and that's actually a really important point. I mean, often I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. Too often we think about introverts as extroverts as this dichotomy, that you're either one or the other. That's not the case. The reality is it's a dimension. So, and like most dimensions, particularly in psychology, most of us are kind of somewhere in the middle. And even, so there's this relatively new phrase called ambivert, which is probably what I am in a way, which is someone that fluctuates backwards and forwards a bit depending on the context, depending on the circumstances. So again, and maybe you're right, so when I get on stage to speak, I almost turn into a different person. I mean, I'm not a different person, but I certainly become a lot more alive and even like I am now, I suppose. I'm kind of energized when I'm talking about something that I'm passionate about. But then in many other situations, I'll go, back more to my sort of natural habitat in a sense, which is a quieter, more insular sort of person. But I think that's the key point. It's not that you're either one or the other. Most of us are kind of in the middle, and there's a few people that are either extreme, and that's, maybe there's a significant difference at those extremes, but for most of us, it's not going to be, certainly won't be the most significant and most important factor.
Okay, so I mean, the natural thing to ask about after that is heritability.
Yeah, another good question, really important question. There's absolutely no doubt that it does play a role. So, like almost every other aspect of our physical and psychological being, genes play a role. So we inherit a certain amount, so obviously through our genetic makeup, which we inherit through our parents and grandparents, etc., we inherit a certain predisposition to things like happiness and optimism, etc. But like a lot of these other things, it's far more complex than just saying yes or no. So there's a couple of things to point out. One, it's definitely not 100%. If it was 100%, then it would be like, there's nothing I can do about it. According to the research, it probably makes up about 40 or 50% of the variance, which is significant, but not 100%.
Yeah.
The good news, I suppose, is that there are other factors over which we have much more control, because obviously we've got little control over our genes, that we can do something about. So there's the context or the situations we put ourselves in make a difference. There are what some psychologists have called intentional behaviours, so how we choose to go about our days. So the things that so for example, I've learnt that exercise is, I exercise regularly not just for the physical benefits, but the psychological benefits. For me, it's a potent antidepressant, stress buster, mood enhancer. Meditation is something I choose to do because it helps me, very much helps me manage my emotions. So there's a whole bunch of things that we can choose to do, coming back to something we talked about earlier, practicing kindness. We can choose to do these things, and if we choose to do the right things, that will significantly influence the extent to which we enjoy happiness. Now, the other part about that is, which is pretty fascinating, and it's pretty early from a scientific point of view, there's a relatively new discipline called epigenetics, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but so in very simple terms, what that means is how I choose to live my life affects the way my genes express themselves. So going back to that, even if my genes played a significant role, and they probably do, I can still influence that in a way by living my life in a certain way, which gives me even more control, in a sense, over my happiness.
Having control over your happiness is actually a really interesting topic to talk about, because to what extent do you think there's a sort of homeostasis at play here, where your body has the ability to kind of regulate your emotional states, and so you have this wide spectrum of emotional states, and it kind of brings you back to normal most of the time after experiencing a spike or a trough?
Yeah, so this is some good research that's often been referred to as the set point theory, which is that we're born with a set happiness point, and that so let's say yours is 8 out of 10 and mine's 7 out of 10, whatever it is, and that no matter what happens, that might go up or down if something good or bad happens, but within, depending on what it is, weeks or months or years, it'll come back to that set point. So that's the classic study. One of the classic studies looked at, for example, lottery winners, which and many people have heard a version of this. So let's, for example, if you won the lottery tomorrow, you won $1 million or $10 million, whatever, you would almost certainly be happier. But we know based on the research that increased happiness would probably be fairly short-lived.
Wasn't it supposed to level out with somebody who broke their neck and was
so again, what we know with lottery winners is that within 3 to 6 to 12 months, roughly, that spike would sort of basically settle back down, which meant if you were happy before, you'd go back to being happy. If you were miserable before, you go back to being miserable. But so the other part of that, as I said, they looked at spinal injury, people who had spinal injuries. And not surprisingly, people were less happy immediately after the injury, which, again, I'm sure people could imagine. But what would surprise a lot of people is that, again, within a relatively short period of time, a matter of months, that downward spike in happiness bounced back up, and most people, most of the time, relatively quickly got back to the same level. So that's pretty powerful. That's pretty, and they've done that with all sorts of other, both adverse life events and positive life events. However, more recently, what the research suggests is that it's probably not a set point; it's probably a set range, which is a different. So it's not just sort of one point. There's probably we almost certainly have a range that we can live in, which I think means we still have control over that. So we've got control at least within our range. Now, what makes it complex is it's very hard to compare my range to your range because it's such a subjective judgment. But I don't think that really matters, because if I say, let's just say I'm 7 out of 10 happiness and you say you're 7 out of 10, that may not mean the same thing, but who cares? It really doesn't matter.
You should be asking, are you in range?
Well, no, what
imagine that relationship having with your wife or something. Hey, honey, in range? Yeah, in range today.
Sort of, and that's a good question. And what we should be working towards is getting to the top of our range.
Yeah.
Now, the top of my range might not be the same as the top of your range, but again, who cares? And that's so even if the top of your range was higher than the top of my range, it shouldn't really matter. If I'm at the top of my range as often as possible, you're not going to be there 100% of the time. Which is another really important point. No one's going to be happy all the time. But if I can get to the top of my range or close to the top as often as possible, that's kind of what I should want to be aiming towards.
And what about happiness? Talking about, you had mentioned to me talking about happiness as an individual construct versus a collective construct. Can you talk a bit about that? Yeah, well, this is something I'm really fascinated with, and something that the research is increasingly focused on. In the early stages of the research, kind of neglected this a bit, but particularly in the last 5-10 years, there's been a lot more focus on cultural differences. And this is one of the things we see. So in simple terms, different cultures have different ways of defining happiness, and different cultures have slightly different ways of pursuing happiness, which shouldn't be that surprising. If you think about it, it shouldn't be a huge surprise. Yeah.
But one of the most stark differences we see, or significant differences, are between so what I might define as sort of the Western cultures, like Australia, America, England, those sorts of places, where we tend to think very individualistically. So if we ask someone in Australia, for example, or in one of those Western countries about happiness, they will tend to think about themselves and how they're feeling now. Now, if you compare that to particularly some of the Southeast Asian countries or South American countries, they have a much more and obviously these are generalisations, but they have a much more collectivist definition and way of framing happiness. So if you ask someone from one of those sorts of places to think about happiness, they will think about their village, their community, their family, their village, their community, and I think it's important not to say one's right or wrong or better or worse, but I certainly think that in our Western societies we could benefit from thinking a bit more about others. We shouldn't ever want happiness or think about happiness as being me, me, me. That sort of selfishness or narcissism is not good. It's not helpful or healthy at all. Happiness is not just about feeling good, it's about doing good. And that means It's about other people in our
Yeah,
lives.
being other-oriented, I should say. It tends to be a big topic these days.
And again, it goes to that thing that I touched on earlier about kindness. Kindness and compassion and generosity. These are things that the wonderful thing about those sorts of virtues is that if I'm kind and generous and caring and compassionate, it helps that other person, say, or those other people, but it also helps me. It's one of those, it sounds a horrible cliche, but it's one of those great win-wins. If I do something nice to you or for you, hopefully you'll get some positive emotion, some pleasure from that. But I feel, in giving we receive. So I feel good about it as well. So
it's better to give gifts than it is to receive them.
Well, receiving should be nice as well. But again, it's...
Not if you've got my friends, so...
Anyway, so it's a great win-win, and that's where the stronger ties we have with others, and the more, again, this is one of my favourite sayings, happiness is not just feeling good, it's doing good.
Right.
The happiest people are definitely not selfish. They tend to be more generous, more giving, more caring. They do more good to others and to the world. So.
And on that topic of the collective construct of the way that different societies place values on what happiness is, or the way it manifests, do you think that has anything to do with the Jonathan Haidt's theory about the quadrants of developed countries and what they tend to focus on culturally? And when it comes to sort of Western developed countries, and we have a certain level of economic wealth and well-being, that we begin to start looking inward for meaning of life more than countries that are developing and just trying to get by. They have different values on what's important to them, their well-being and their happiness.
I love his work, so I recently read The Righteous Mind. I think it's one of his. Amazing. So I find it incredibly helpful, but it's also, as you kind of hint at there, it is quite complex, and this is where it gets really tricky. So it's too easy, and I do this a lot of the time because a lot of my work is trying to communicate scientific principles to lay people. So by definition, to non-psychologists and non-academics, and so by definition, I have to simplify stuff. But the risk is that we lose a lot of the nuance, and certainly Jonathan Haidt, his work doesn't lose the nuance, which makes it, I think, hard to. It's hard for non-academics or to read. But it's really, really important. So, for example, he talks about, there's different virtues and so there's no right or wrongs really. And one of the things that many of us could do better is understanding, different perspectives. So he's written a lot, obviously, recently about the political divide and how can, particularly in America, for example, how can the left and right understand each other better, because it's become so divided, much more so than here. We've got a bit of that here, but it's so much more extreme there. And I think that's incredibly important, because I think if we can't, if you only understand like-minded people, then, well, that's too easy.
You may as well not bother.
You may as well, it's almost not playing the game. And so there's something I try really hard to do, and I really struggle, but I really work hard to try and understand people, not just political, but political views, religious views, all sorts of things. And I think, and so, sorry, to come back to your question, that's what, that's partly what that's about, is understanding those different quadrants, those different levels, and knowing, and I suppose, I guess, coming back to happiness, knowing that, that different things will make different people happy, and that's okay, obviously.
I'll sort of finish up with, it's kind of on that topic. It's about our society now and the values that we place on happiness and stuff like that. We're kind of talking about entertainment, social media, and, well, what I might call the manifestation of unattainable draw cards of happiness, or lifestyles, or whatever they are. If people these days are kind of watching abundant lifestyles and putting a lot of value on things like that, is there actually real potential for danger psychologically by constantly having that benchmark within your head of what you're supposed to attain?
Without a doubt. So I kind of have a love-hate relationship with social media. I mean, I think there's a lot of great things about it, and I use it professionally. I'm not that active personally on it, but in my professional life, I'm quite active on social media. And there's a lot of benefits, there's a lot of good things that come from it. But I agree 100%. There definitely are some risks, and this is what what psychologists technically call social comparison. It's just pretty self-explanatory, but comparing yourself to other people or other people's lives that maybe, often in that sort of circumstance are unattainable. And what we forget is that for 99.9% of the history of humanity, that never happened. So the rich and poor, the haves and the have-nots, the royalty and the peasants, whatever you want to call it, barely interacted. They didn't, and so they never saw that. And so it wasn't really an issue. So the fact that it is an issue now, and the fact that so many of us struggle, it's not surprising that we struggle with it, because it's such a new issue in terms of human. I mean, even if you think we're all so used to social media now, but I mean, Facebook's only, was it 15 years old or
less? I think
less than that. Instagram's 10. That's nothing in the scheme of history.
We're all part of this grand experiment to which we did not consent, I guess.
Well, that's the thing. Well, we are consenting. It's just that we're not everyone's doing it consciously.
Yeah, I think
mindfully.
More broadly, we're not consenting.
Yeah. But you're right. It's a massive experiment, and as I said, I think there's good and bad. But sorry, to come back to your question, there definitely are some risks. And for example, if I'm constantly looking at, I'll just say Instagram, but it could be any other, whatever medium you want. But if I'm constantly looking at people that are richer than me, as we talked about earlier, I'm going to feel poor all the time. If I look at people that are better looking at me, which isn't hard to do, I'm going to feel ugly all the time. Which goes to like body image, for example, for historically for women, but increasingly for men, is a massive problem. So if I'm looking at health and lifestyle influencers who have got six packs and biceps and everything, even if I exercise regularly and keep healthy, which I do, I'm never going to be at that level for a variety of reasons. So there is a risk, as I talked about earlier, with the unrealistic expectations, that if I follow the wrong sorts of pages, that I'm going to constantly feel miserable all the time. Which isn't good, and it can actually be dangerous if I have a predisposition to depression, or in other contexts to anxiety. So for example, if you're following certain pages that are constantly focusing on and Twitter tends to be worse for this, negative news, catastrophe, or whatever, that can cause significant anxiety. I mean, it does even in me, and I don't have a significant anxiety disorder, but so particularly in recent days and weeks, Facebook's copped some criticism, justifiably so. I think that it's like they design it. It's like gambling. It's like drug addiction. It's designed, and in some ways I admire. I mean, it's incredibly impressive what they can do, but we do need to be very careful. And I suppose that's what I say. And I talk to parents a lot about this who are concerned about adolescent children, that we could rule it out of our lives. I mean, there are people that are totally off that, and that's fine. Good luck to them. But most of us don't necessarily want to do that. So unless you choose to completely opt out, which you can do, what we can do, and to come back to your bit earlier about this as an experiment, we can choose how we use it. So we can choose who we follow, or who we like. We can choose how much time we spend on it. We can take breaks if we need to. So this is what, for people like myself who don't want to completely opt out, what we can do is be a bit more mindful, or a bit more conscious in how we use it to minimise, if not totally eliminate, but to minimise those risks. Yeah.
And do you see a lot of evidence of the psychological effects of just more broadly with technology, the absolute triage of information that people have to deal with, notifications, emails, apps?
Without a doubt. And so with the work bit, for example, there's a lot of debate about how, particularly for white-collar professionals, that you're never off. Email's always on, SMS is always on, Slack messages or whatever is on. So again, I think it's up to us. I mean, we can and need to take control over that, and there are a lot of advantages to that. I mean, that allows me and many others to work remotely from. So I think again, it's important to note there are pros and cons. It's not all bad. I mean, technology is incredible in so many ways. There's so many fantastic things we can do about it, but we do need to be careful. We need to, I guess, at the risk of oversimplifying, make the most of those good bits, which can be unbelievably fantastic, whilst also containing and managing the potentially dangerous bits. And that's, I know that's easier said than done, but again, I think we do have control over that. We've got more control than most people realise. So.
I'm going to round this up with 3 more quick-fire questions. They're the
scared?
ones that you don't like.
No.
But I'm going to do it anyway. This is a great one for you. If you had to change professions and you could do anything else you wanted, regardless of qualification, what would it be?
I have thought about that a bit actually, and I've been asked that before. And this is kind of cheating because I'm almost already doing. So if someone asked me what I do, I say I'm a psychologist. If I had to or chose to be something else, I would probably say be a writer, and that's I do a lot of that anyway. But that's if I had to be a little bit different again, being a journalist was one of the only other things that I kind of seriously considered at any point in my life. Outside of that, I'd be stuffed. I'm really not sure what I'd do.
That's the only contribution you have
Yeah.
to society. Thanks, Tim. If you had to live in another country, other than the one that you do, where would that be and why?
That's a good question. I don't really like the idea of patriotism or nationalism, but I do love Australia, and I think taking everything into account, it's pretty hard to beat, I think. I have very, very fond memories when I was a younger backpacker of Spain, and I've always wanted to go back. I don't know if that's quite the same as living there, and I think, and particularly at the moment, for economic and other reasons, that might not be the greatest idea, but I'd love to go back one day and maybe try that out. The other one that sort of came to mind, which is strange because I've never actually been there, is New Zealand. I've definitely wanted to go. I've loved so many people rave about the walking and the nature and the beautiful places, and I think it would be a great, from what I've heard anyway, a great place to live in, and obviously similar to Australia in some ways. So I think one or other of them.
Yeah. If you had to spend a whole day with a clone of yourself, what would be the most annoying thing about your clone?
Oh, that would be a fucking nightmare. Jeez. What would be the most... Probably that I'd be apologising all the time. But for saying sorry for being...
Would you both be apologising?
Yeah, that's what I mean. It'd be like some Twilight Zone or Black Mirror kind of weird... it'd be... my mind's about to explode.
Okay. Thank you so much for talking.